Sarah Mitchell couldn't see the man watching her. She couldn't see the way his eyes narrowed as he flicked his cigarette to the ground, or the way his smirk twisted into something cruel. But Bud, her guide dog, could. Central Park was supposed to be her sanctuary. The worn bench under the oak tree was where she came to feel normal again, to feel safe. The soft rustle of leaves, the laughter of children, the distant bark of a dog. It all felt peaceful, but not today. Beside her, Bud was tense. His sharp ears twitched at every sound, his body rigid. Sarah could feel the tension through the leash, and her calm began to crack. "It's okay, Bud," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. Across the park, Hank McCoy leaned against his motorcycle, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't the type to blend in. His shaved head gleamed in the sunlight, and his group of leather-clad bikers hung on his every word. But his attention wasn't on them, it was on Sarah. "Look at her," he sneered, "sitting there like she owns the place. And that dog, what's he trying to prove?" His friends chuckled as Hank shoved away from his bike. The thud of his boots on the pavement was heavy and deliberate. Bud's growl deepened, a low rumble that made Sarah's stomach knot. She tilted her head, listening to the approaching footsteps. Her fingers tightened around the leash as the air around her seemed to shift. Something wasn't right. "Hey there," a voice called out, mocking and sharp. Sarah froze. She couldn't see the man, but she could feel the malice in his tone, like a cold wind cutting through the park. Beside her, Bud stiffened, his growl rising like a warning siren. The man's heavy boots thudded against the pavement, getting closer. "Nice dog you've got," he sneered, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Does he do tricks? Maybe he can roll over for us." Sarah's grip on Bud's leash tightened. Her heart raced as she tilted her head toward the sound. "Leave us alone," she said firmly, her voice steady but tinged with unease. The man laughed, loud and mocking. "Oh, tough girl, huh?" He clapped his hands loudly, trying to provoke Bud. The dog didn't flinch, his piercing gaze locked on the approaching figure. But the growl in his chest deepened, vibrating through the air. A few people in the park paused, glancing in their direction. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, but no one stepped forward. Sarah felt exposed, the weight of their stares adding to the knot of fear in her chest. The man took another step closer, and his voice grew louder, feeding off the crowd's attention. "Come on, let's see what this mutt's got." His friends, watching from a distance, cheered him on. Bud's growl turned into a sharp bark, breaking through the tension like a thunderclap. Sarah gripped the leash with both hands, her knuckles turning white. "I said leave us alone," she repeated, her voice trembling now. But the man didn't stop. He raised his foot slightly, just enough to send a message. "What's the big deal?" "He's just a dog," he said, smirking. Then, as if daring fate, he lifted his boot higher. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Don't you dare!" she cried, her voice cracking. The crowd stood frozen, their murmurs growing louder. A woman's voice broke through the whispers. Someone should stop him. But no one moved. What the man didn't know was that Bud wasn't just any dog. Before becoming Sarah's guide, Bud had been trained for something far greater. As a former K-9 military service dog, he had faced danger in ways this man couldn't imagine. Bud's body tensed like a coiled spring, his instincts kicking in. His growl grew deeper, vibrating with a sense of control and power. The air around them felt thick, heavy with tension. The man took one final step closer, raising his boot as if to strike. "Come on, mutt, show me what you've got," he sneered, his voice echoing across the park. The moment hung in the air, fragile and electric. As the man's boot moved closer, Bud sprang into action. In one swift motion, the German Shepherd sidestepped the kick with precision, letting out a sharp bark that shattered the tension in the park. The sound wasn't just a warning, it was a command. The crowd gasped as Bud planted himself firmly in front of Sarah, his sharp teeth bared, his eyes locked on the man. Every muscle in his body was tense, radiating power and control. "What the hell?" the man muttered, stumbling backward. His confident smirk faltered for the first time. Bud didn't move, his stance unwavering. His growl was low and guttural, vibrating with the kind of authority that demanded respect. This wasn't the behavior of an ordinary dog. It was something far more disciplined, far more dangerous. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" That dog's a professional. Phones were raised, cameras recording every second of the confrontation. Then an older man stepped forward from the gathering. His weathered face was shadowed by a military cap, the insignia glinting faintly in the sunlight. His voice was calm but firm as he pointed at Bud. "That's no ordinary dog," he said. "That's a K9. The words sent a ripple through the onlookers. Sarah furrowed her brow, confused. She crouched down slightly, her hand brushing Bud's back, as if seeking reassurance. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Bud. "Dogs like him are trained for combat. They're soldiers, taught to protect, to fight, to take down threats." He paused, his tone growing more certain. "That bark, that stance, it's instinct, the kind you don't just forget." Sarah felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Her fingers tightened on Bud's leash as her mind raced. Bud? A soldier? She had always known he was special. But this? Beside her, Bud didn't flinch. His focus remained entirely on the man who had threatened them. The growl rumbling in his chest was steady, controlled, like he was waiting for the next move. The man in front of them stumbled again, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Bud's unrelenting stare. "What's this dog's problem?" he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. A new voice broke through the crowd. "The problem," said a park ranger, stepping forward, "is you." His tone was sharp, commanding attention. "Threatening a guide dog isn't just reckless, it's illegal." The man froze, his shoulders slumping. "I wasn't serious," he muttered defensively. "It was just a joke." The ranger crossed his arms, his gaze stern. "You call that a joke?" He gestured toward Bud. "This dog is doing his job, and by the looks of it, he's better at his job than you are at being a decent person." The crowd murmured in agreement. Bud's growl had softened, but his body remained tense, ready to act if needed. Sarah, still crouched beside Bud, felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched his head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. The older man with the military cap stepped closer, his tone softer now. "Ma'am, you should know something. Dogs like him don't just forget their training. It's buried deep, waiting for moments like this. He thought you needed him today, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to you." The weight of his words settled over Sarah. Tears pricked her eyes as she ran her fingers through Bud's fur. She had always trusted him, but now she realized he had been protecting her in ways she never even understood. The man who had started it all took a step back, his hands raised in a weak attempt to defend himself. All right," he muttered, his voice small. "I didn't mean any harm." The park ranger didn't buy it. "You've done enough," he said firmly. "Now leave." With the crowd's eyes still on him, the man turned and walked away, his tough guy act shattered. The murmurs around them began to fade, but Sarah stayed where she was, her hand resting on Bud's head. "You've always been my protector," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But I never knew how far you'd go for me." Bud finally relaxed, his posture softening as the threat disappeared. But his eyes continued to scan the park, ensuring everything was safe. That evening, Sarah couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. The park, the man, the older veteran's words. It all felt surreal. She sat on the edge of her couch, Bud lying quietly by her feet, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. "Bud," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Is it true? Were you really a soldier?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy with meaning. Sarah reached for her laptop, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. What could she even search for? She typed slowly, the words "military K9 history" appearing on the screen. As she clicked through article after article, a new world opened before her. These dogs weren't just pets. They were heroes. Trained for combat, detection, and protection, they worked side by side with soldiers in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. They saved lives, risking their own without hesitation. Sarah's heart ached as she read stories of retired K9s. Many of them struggled to adjust to civilian life after their service, carrying unseen scars from their time in combat. She glanced down at Bud, her hand brushing through his thick fur. He seemed calm now, but what had he been through before coming to her? The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called a local veterans organization, explaining what had happened in the park and asking if there was any way to learn more about Bud's past. The woman on the other end of the line listened carefully, her tone thoughtful. Many retired canines are placed in new roles like guiding or therapy, she explained. It's a way to give them purpose after their service. If you can provide his ID tag number, we might be able to trace his history. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do whatever it takes. Later that day, Sarah carefully removed Bud's collar, her fingers tracing over the small metal tag. She found the number etched on the back and sent it to the organization. The wait felt endless, each passing hour filling her with both anticipation and unease. When the phone finally rang, Sarah answered it with trembling hands. Miss Mitchell, this is Karen from the Veterans Organization, the voice said. We found some information about your dog. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Your dog's ID matches a retired K9 named Bravo. He served overseas alongside a handler, Sergeant Jake Carter. They were deployed on multiple missions before Bravo retired. Hearing Bud referred to as Bravo felt strange, almost like she was meeting him for the first time. Bravo, she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. Karen continued, her voice warm but steady. Sergeant Carter retired a few years ago. He now lives in Montana. If you'd like, I can provide his contact information. He might be able to tell you more about Bravo's service. Sarah quickly jotted down the details, her hands trembling. When the call ended, she looked down at Bud, who was lying calmly by her side. Bravo, she whispered again, the name carrying a weight she didn't fully understand. That evening, Sarah sat on the couch, her phone resting on the table in front of her. She had rehearsed what to say to Sergeant Carter over and over in her mind, but her nerves kept stopping her. What if reaching out to him brought up painful memories? What if he didn't want to talk about Bravo? She glanced at Bud, who looked up at her with his steady, loyal eyes. He had always been there for her. Now it was her turn to do the same for him. Summoning her courage, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Hello. Her breath hitched, but she steadied herself. Hi, is this Sergeant Jake Carter? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I think I have your former K9. Bravo. There was a long pause on the other end. For a moment, Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Then Jake's voice returned, thick with emotion. Bravo? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you serious? I thought I'd never hear anything about him again. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened to the emotion in his voice. He's been with me for a few years now, she said softly. I had no idea about his past until recently. He saved me in ways I can't even explain. Jake let out a shaky breath. He saved my life too, more times than I can count. His voice cracked, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. I need to see him, he said. Please, tell me where you are. I'll fly out as soon as I can. Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Of course, she said, her voice trembling. As she hung up the phone, she looked down at Bud, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. We're going to meet him, Bud, she said softly. The man who was your whole world before me. Bud tilted his head slightly, as if sensing her emotions. Sarah stroked his fur, whispering, I'll figure this out, Bud. Together, we'll uncover your story. The days leading up to Sergeant Jake Carter's visit felt like an eternity for Sarah. She tried to stick to her daily routine, but the anticipation hung heavy in the air. Every time she brushed Bud's fur or heard his steady breathing at night, she wondered how he would react. Would he remember Jake? Would this reunion change the bond they shared? On the afternoon of Jake's arrival, Sarah waited outside her small apartment with Bud by her side. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the leash, her heart pounding with nerves. Beside her, Bud shifted his weight, sensing her unease. It's going to be okay, Bud, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. A car pulled up, the sound of the engine cutting through the stillness. The door slammed and a deep voice called out, Sarah? Yes, I'm Sarah, she replied nervously. Her voice caught slightly as she added, and this? She gestured toward the dog at her side. This is Bravo. At the sound of his old name, Bud's ears perked up. His body tensed as if he recognized it. but he didn't move. Jake approached slowly, his steps cautious. He was a tall man with weathered features and a quiet strength about him. His voice trembled as he knelt down, extending a hand. "Hey there, boy," he said softly. "Do you remember me?" For a moment, everything stood still. Bud didn't move, his eyes locked on Jake's face. The leash in Sarah's hand vibrated slightly as Bud shifted his weight, his body rigid with tension. Then almost imperceptibly, Bud leaned forward. He sniffed Jake's outstretched hand, and something seemed to click. His tail began to wag, slow at first, then faster. A low whimpering sound escaped his throat, a sound Sarah had never heard before. Jake's voice broke as he reached out to gently stroke Bud's head. "You do remember me," he whispered. His hands trembled as he ran them over the dog's fur, his eyes glistening with tears. "God, I missed you." Sarah felt her own tears welling up as she watched the reunion unfold. She had always known Bud was special, but seeing this connection between him and Jake added a depth to her understanding of him she hadn't thought possible. They moved inside, the three of them sitting together in Sarah's small living room. Jake began sharing stories, his voice thick with emotion. "Bravo was my partner on every mission," he said. "We went through hell together. He saved my life more times than I can count. Fearless, smart, loyal. He was everything I needed out there." Sarah listened intently, her fingers brushing through Bud's fur. Each story painted a vivid picture of the life Bud had lived before coming to her. The danger, the sacrifices, the unbreakable bond between man and dog. It was a world she could barely imagine. Jake's voice softened as he looked at Bud. "When it was time for him to retire, I didn't want to let him go, but they told me he'd be placed somewhere safe, with someone who needed him." He glanced at Sarah, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad it was you." Sarah's chest tightened. "Thank you for trusting me with him," she said quietly. "I had no idea he'd already saved so many lives before he came to me." Jake knelt down beside Bud again, his voice gentle. "He's still the same dog, still the same Bravo, but now he's yours." As the evening drew to a close, Jake prepared to leave. He knelt beside Bud one last time, resting his hand on the dog's head. "You've got a good life now, boy," he said softly. "Take care of her, okay?" Bud leaned into Jake's touch, his eyes warm and understanding. Jake stood, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "You're lucky to have him," he said. Sarah nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know." As Jake walked out the door, Sarah looked down at Bud, who had settled at her feet. She stroked his fur, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been through so much, haven't you? But no matter what, you're home now." Bud let out a soft sigh, his presence grounding her in the moment. Sarah smiled through her tears, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The days after Jake's visit felt different for Sarah. Every time she looked at Bud, she thought about the stories Jake had shared, the missions, the danger, the unwavering loyalty. Bud wasn't just her guide dog anymore. He was Bravo, a soldier who had given so much before coming into her life. One morning, as Sarah held Bud's leash and prepared for their walk, she paused. A thought tugged at her heart. Was she giving him the life he deserved? Bud seemed content, always by her side. But was there something he was missing? That afternoon, Sarah began researching retired K-9 programs. She read about places where dogs like Bud could engage in activities that mirrored their old training: tracking, agility, scent detection. These programs weren't just for exercise. They were designed to give retired service dogs a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah picked up the phone, her voice hesitant but determined. "My dog, Bravo, he's a retired K-9. I think he might benefit from your program." The woman on the other end was enthusiastic. "We'd love to evaluate him," she said. "These sessions are tailored to each dog, and from what you've told me, he'd thrive here." The following week, Sarah and Bud arrived at the facility. The property was vast, with open fields, obstacle courses, and small groups of handlers working with their dogs. As soon as they stepped through the gate, Bud's demeanor changed. His ears perked up, his tail wagged slightly, and there was an energy in his movements that Sarah hadn't seen before. A trainer approached, smiling warmly. "This must be Bravo," she said, kneeling to greet him. "Let's see what he remembers." Sarah watched nervously as the trainer led Bud through a series of tasks. He moved with precision and confidence, weaving through obstacles, following commands, and tracking scents as if no time had passed. Sarah's chest tightened as she watched him come alive, every movement a reminder of the extraordinary life he had lived before her. When the session ended, the trainer returned, her expression glowing with admiration. "He's incredible," she said. "It's like he never left the field." Sarah nodded, pride and bittersweet emotions swirling in her chest. She knelt beside Bud, stroking his fur. "You're amazing," she whispered. "I didn't even know you had this in you." That evening back at home, Sarah sat on the floor beside Bud. "I'll make sure you never lose this part of yourself," she promised. "Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together." Bud leaned into her touch, his steady presence a silent reassurance. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Sarah's life. Every Saturday, she and Bud returned to the training facility. He thrived in the environment, tackling the exercises with enthusiasm and focus. Watching him brought Sarah a sense of pride, but also a deeper understanding of who Bud truly was. One afternoon after a particularly successful session, the trainer pulled Sarah aside. "I've worked with a lot of retired canines," she said, "but Bravo is something special. Dogs like him are rare. His focus, his discipline, it's clear he loved his work." Sarah hesitated, her voice soft. "Do you think he's happy?" The trainer's expression softened. "Happiness for dogs like him comes from having a purpose," she said. "And Sarah, you're part of that purpose." That night, as Sarah sat in her living room with Bud at her feet, she reflected on the trainer's words. She had once believed their relationship was one-sided, that she depended on Bud far more than he depended on her. But now she realized it was a partnership. He guided her through her challenges, and she gave him the purpose he needed to thrive. "You've never stopped being a hero, have you?" she whispered, stroking his fur. "Even now, you're still looking out for me." Bud let out a soft sigh, his warm presence grounding her. For Sarah, one thing was clear. Bud wasn't just her guide dog. He was her protector, her partner, and her constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always someone who would stand by her side. Weeks passed, and Sarah began to feel a deeper connection with Bud. No, Bravo. Every time they walked through the park or crossed a busy street, she thought about his past. He had once been a soldier, facing dangers she could barely imagine, and now he had chosen to stay by her side, guiding her through her own battles. One evening, Sarah and Bud returned to the familiar bench in the park, the same bench where their lives had shifted weeks ago. This time the air felt different, peaceful, not tense. As Sarah sat, she ran her fingers through Bud's fur. "You've done so much for so many people," she murmured, "and yet here you are, choosing to be with me." Her voice wavered as gratitude filled her chest. Bud nudged her leg gently, as if to say he understood. Sarah thought back to something Jake had told her during his visit. "He doesn't live in the past, Sarah. Dogs like him, they live for their people. Right now, you're his mission." Those words had stayed with her, a constant reminder of the bond they shared. "You're my hero," she whispered to Bud, "not just because of what you've done, but because of who you are. You've given me strength even when I didn't know I needed it." The park grew quieter as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Sarah leaned back, letting the cool evening breeze wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. Later that night, as Sarah sat on the floor of her living room, Bud rested beside her. She reached out, her hand brushing his thick fur. "You've always been more than just my guide dog," she said softly. "You're my partner, my protector, my family." Bud let out a soft huff, leaning into her touch. His calm, steady presence grounded her in the moment. Sarah smiled through the tears that prickled her eyes. "Whatever the future holds, we'll face it together," she said. For Sarah, Bud wasn't just a dog. He was a constant reminder that even the darkest paths could be navigated with the right companion by your side. And for Bud, Sarah wasn't just someone to guide. She was someone to protect, to love, and to dedicate himself to. As they sat together, the quiet of the night wrapping around them, one thing was certain: their story was far from over.